The gun trembled in Karen Morrison's weathered hands as she pointed it at the tall black man in the elegant tuxedo. Her voice cracked with false authority as she barked her command into the dimly lit backstage corridor of the Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall. "Don't you dare move another step. I know exactly what you're up to, and I'm not going to let it happen on my watch." Antoine Williams froze mid-stride, his cello case heavy in his left hand, his conductor's baton clutched in his right. The ornate backstage hallway, lined with portraits of legendary composers and conductors, suddenly felt like a prison. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly raised his free hand. The familiar weight of Brahms's symphony, note for sheet music, rustling in his jacket pocket. This was supposed to be the night of his dreams, the culmination of 20 years of relentless pursuit of musical excellence. Instead, he found himself staring down the barrel of a security guard's weapon, 30 minutes before the most important concert of his career. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Antoine said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I'm Antoine Williams. I'm conducting tonight's performance." Karen's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the gun. She was a woman in her late 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face weathered by years of suspicion and barely contained anger. The security badge pinned to her navy blazer gleamed under the corridor's harsh fluorescent lights. She had worked at the Grand Metropolitan for 15 years, and in all that time, she had never seen a black man in a tuxedo backstage unless he was part of the cleaning crew or catering staff. Conducting Karen's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Nice try, buddy. I've seen every conductor who's set foot in this hall, and you're not one of them. Now put down that case and keep your hands where I can see them. Security's already on the way." The sound of footsteps echoed from the main hallway as the evening's audience began to arrive. Through the thick walls, Antoine could hear the familiar pre-concert chatter, the rustle of programs, the anticipatory hum that always preceded a sold-out performance. Tonight's concert was historic. He was the first black conductor to lead the Grand Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra, and the national media had taken notice. The pressure had been immense, but Antoine had thrived under it, spending months preparing for this moment. Born in Detroit to a family where music was both refuge and religion, Antoine had discovered his passion for conducting at the age of 12 when his middle school music teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had placed a baton in his small hands. "You have the gift," she had told him, watching as he instinctively began to shape the air with fluid, graceful movements. "But gift alone won't be enough. You'll have to be twice as good to get half the recognition." Those words had driven him through years at Juilliard, through countless auditions where he was the only black face in a sea of white candidates, through guest conducting positions with smaller orchestras across the country. He had built his reputation performance by performance, note by note, earning the respect of musicians and critics alike. The call from the Grand Metropolitan's board of directors 3 months ago had felt like vindication, like finally reaching the summit of a mountain he had been climbing his entire adult life. "Listen to me carefully," Antoine said, his voice gaining strength. "My name is Antoine Williams. I am the guest conductor for tonight's performance of Brahms's Symphony, No. 4. The concert begins in 30 minutes, and there are 2,000 people out there waiting to hear this orchestra perform. If you don't let me pass, you're going to have a very serious problem on your hands." Karen's face flushed red. She had seen his type before, smooth talkers who thought they could convince her of anything. In her 15 years of security work, she had developed an instinct for troublemakers, and this man fit the profile perfectly. Young, black, too confident, carrying expensive-looking equipment that he had probably stolen. The tuxedo was a nice touch, she had to admit, but it didn't fool her for a second. You expect me to believe that the Grand Metropolitan hired you to conduct their orchestra? Karen's voice dripped with sarcasm. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? I've worked here for 15 years, and I've never seen a black conductor on this stage. Not once. So why don't you drop the act and tell me what you're really doing here? Did someone put you up to this? Is this some kind of protest? The words hit Antoine like physical blows. He had faced racism throughout his career, but it had rarely been this blatant, this venomous. Usually, it came disguised as polite skepticism, as questions about his qualifications, or suggestions that he might be more comfortable with certain types of music. This raw, undisguised prejudice left him momentarily speechless. From the main hallway came the sound of voices, growing louder and more concerned. The concert hall's assistant manager, Patricia Chen, appeared at the end of the corridor, her face pale with worry. She had been looking for Antoine, growing increasingly anxious as the start time approached. Antoine, thank God we found you. The orchestra is... Patricia stopped mid-sentence as she saw the gun pointed at the conductor. Karen, what are you doing? Put that weapon down immediately. Karen didn't lower the gun. If anything, her grip tightened further. This man is trespassing. Patricia, he's impersonating a conductor, and I caught him trying to access the stage with stolen equipment. I'm detaining him until the police arrive. Patricia's face went from pale to ashen. She had worked with Antoine extensively over the past 3 months, planning every detail of tonight's performance. She knew his reputation, his credentials, his extraordinary talent. She also knew that Karen Morrison had a history of what the management delicately called overzealous security measures, particularly when it came to people of color. Karen, this is Antoine Williams. He's tonight's guest conductor. I've been working with him for months. Now put that gun down before you cause an international incident. But Karen was beyond reason now. The adrenaline of the confrontation, combined with years of resentment and barely suppressed racial animosity, had created a perfect storm of irrational fury. In her mind, she was protecting the institution she had served faithfully for 15 years from some elaborate con game. I don't care what you call him, Karen snapped. Look at him. Does he look like a conductor to you? This is obviously some kind of setup, some kind of political statement. Well, not on my watch. Not in my concert hall. The situation was spiraling out of control. More staff members had gathered at the end of the corridor, drawn by the raised voices and the alarming sight of drawn weapon. Among them was Marcus Thompson, the orchestra's principal violinist and Antoine's longtime friend. Marcus had known Antoine since their days at Juilliard, had watched him develop from a promising student into one of the most gifted conductors of their generation. Karen, you need to stop this right now, Marcus said, stepping forward despite the gun. Antoine is not just a conductor. He's one of the best conductors in the country. He's conducted the Chicago Symphony, the Boston Pops, orchestras across Europe. Tonight's concert has been sold out for weeks because people want to hear him conduct. But Karen was no longer listening to reason. The presence of witnesses, the growing crowd, the sense that she was being challenged and contradicted, only fueled her determination. She was going to prove them all wrong. Show them that she wasn't some foolish old woman who could be taken in by a sophisticated con. I'm calling the police, Karen announced, fumbling for her radio with her free hand while keeping the gun trained on Antoine. This charade ends now. The radio crackled to life, and Karen's voice filled the corridor. This is Morrison at the Grand Metropolitan. I need backup immediately. I've detained a suspected trespasser attempting to impersonate a staff member. He's armed with what appears to be stolen equipment. Antoine closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. How many black men had stood in similar situations, facing accusations they couldn't disprove, confronting prejudice so entrenched that facts couldn't penetrate it? He thought of his grandmother, who had lived through the Jim Crow era, who had told him stories of a time when a black man could be accused of any crime simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this was different. This wasn't the Jim Crow South. This was 2023 in one of the most prestigious concert halls in the country. And he had allies. Patricia was already on her phone, calling the concert hall's board of directors. Marcus was documenting everything with his smartphone, live streaming the confrontation to his social media accounts. The story was spreading in real time, even as it unfolded. The police arrived within minutes, their heavy footsteps echoing through the corridor. Officer Robert Hayes, a veteran of the force with 23 years of experience, took one look at the scene and immediately began trying to de-escalate the situation. He could see the expensive tuxedo, the professional quality cello case, the frightened but dignified demeanor of the man being held at gunpoint. Nothing about the situation made sense. "Everyone stay calm," Officer Hayes said, his voice steady and authoritative. "Karen, lower your weapon. We can sort this out without anyone getting hurt." Karen reluctantly complied, though she kept her hand near her holster. "Officer Hayes, this man is impersonating a conductor. He's trespassing with stolen equipment. I demand you arrest him immediately." Officer Hayes turned to Antoine, who was slowly lowering his hands. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification." Antoine reached carefully into his jacket pocket and withdrew his wallet, extracting his driver's license, his Juilliard alumni card, and his American Federation of Musicians membership card. He handed them to the officer, along with a copy of his contract with the Grand Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. "I'm Antoine Williams," he said quietly. "I'm conducting tonight's performance of Brahms' Symphony No. 4. The concert is supposed to begin in 20 minutes. Officer Hayes examined the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave as he realized the magnitude of the situation. The contract was official, bearing the signatures of the orchestra's board of directors and the seal of the Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall. The identification was legitimate. The man standing before him wasn't a trespasser or an imposter. He was exactly who he claimed to be. The corridor was now crowded with staff members, orchestra musicians, and even some early arriving audience members who had heard the commotion. Among them was Sarah Martinez, a music journalist for the city's largest newspaper, who had been planning to interview Antoine after the concert. She was now frantically taking notes, realizing that she was witnessing a story that would make headlines across the country. Patricia Chen had reached the board chairman, Robert Whitman, on her phone. Whitman was one of the city's most prominent philanthropists, a man whose name appeared on buildings and hospital wings throughout the metropolitan area. His reputation, and by extension the reputation of the concert hall, was now in serious jeopardy. "Mr. Whitman is on his way," Patricia announced. "He wants everyone to remain calm until he arrives." But calm was the last thing anyone felt. The orchestra members were growing increasingly agitated, not just because of the injustice being perpetrated against their conductor, but because the concert was now in serious jeopardy. 2,000 people had paid premium prices to hear Antoine Williams conduct, and word of the incident was spreading through the audience like wildfire. Marcus Thompson's live stream had gone viral, with thousands of viewers watching the confrontation in real time. The comments were pouring in, a mixture of outrage, support for Antoine, and calls for justice. Justice for Antoine was already trending on social media, and major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. In the midst of the chaos, Antoine stood with quiet dignity, his conductor's baton still clutched in his hand. He had dreamed of this night for so long, had prepared so meticulously, had overcome so many obstacles to reach this moment. Now it was all falling apart because of one woman's prejudice and paranoia. But Antoine had learned something important over the years. Music had the power to transform, to heal, to bridge divides that seemed insurmountable. Even now, in this moment of crisis, he clung to that belief. If he could just get to the podium, if he could just raise his baton and bring the orchestra to life, maybe something beautiful could still emerge from this ugliness. Robert Whitman burst through the crowd, his face red with exertion and barely controlled fury. He was a small man in his 70s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. But now, he looked disheveled, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an urgency that everyone could feel. "What in God's name is happening here?" Whitman demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Officer Hayes stepped forward with the identification documents. "Mr. Whitman, I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. This is Antoine Williams, your guest conductor. He was detained by security under suspicion of trespassing and impersonation." Whitman's face went through a remarkable transformation, from confusion to recognition to horror, as the full implications of the situation became clear. He had personally hired Antoine, had been present at the board meeting where his appointment was unanimously approved. He had seen Antoine's credentials, had listened to recordings of his previous performances, had been instrumental in bringing him to the Grand Metropolitan. "Antoine," Whitman said, his voice heavy with embarrassment and regret, "I am so deeply sorry. This is inexcusable. Karen, you're terminated immediately. Officer Hayes, I hope you understand that this man is our guest conductor, and he needs to be on stage in 15 minutes. Karen's face went white as the reality of her situation finally penetrated her wall of righteous indignation. She had just held the Grand Metropolitan's guest conductor at gunpoint, had accused him of being a criminal, had called him a fraud and an imposter. The legal and professional ramifications were staggering. But he doesn't look like a conductor," Karen stammered, her voice small and defeated. "I've never seen a black conductor here before. I was just trying to protect the hall." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in the corridor could hear the raw prejudice in Karen's voice, the assumption that a black man couldn't possibly be qualified to conduct a major symphony orchestra. It was racism in its purest form, stripped of all pretense and euphemism. Antoine looked at Karen for a long moment, seeing not just an individual, but a system, a mindset, a history of exclusion and discrimination that had followed him throughout his career. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, the justified fury at being humiliated and threatened. But he also felt something else: pity for a woman so trapped by her own prejudices that she couldn't see the truth, even when it was standing right in front of her. "Ms. Morrison," Antoine said quietly, "I understand that you've never seen a black conductor at the Grand Metropolitan before. That's exactly why tonight is so important. Not just for me, but for every young black musician who dreams of standing on that stage someday. Your assumptions about what a conductor should look like are part of the problem we're trying to solve." The corridor fell silent, except for the distant sound of the audience settling into their seats. The clock on the wall showed 8 minutes until the scheduled start time. Antoine could feel the weight of expectation, the pressure of history, the hopes of everyone who had fought for this opportunity. Officer Hayes stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, do you want to press charges against Ms. Morrison for assault with a deadly weapon. Antoine considered the question carefully. He could press charges, could make sure that Karen Morrison faced the full legal consequences of her actions. He would be within his rights to do so, and many people would expect it. But he also knew that prosecuting Karen wouldn't undo the damage, wouldn't heal the wounds that had been opened, wouldn't address the systemic issues that had made this confrontation possible in the first place. Officer Hayes, I appreciate your concern, but right now I have a more pressing obligation. There are 2,000 people in that concert hall who came to hear Brahms's Symphony No. 4, and I intend to give them the performance they deserve. We can discuss legal matters after the concert. Robert Whitman stepped forward, placing a hand on Antoine's shoulder. Antoine, are you sure you want to go through with the concert after what you've just experienced? No one would blame you if you needed time to recover. Antoine straightened his bow tie and adjusted his cuffs, the simple gestures helping him center himself for the performance ahead. Mr. Whitman, I've been preparing for this concert for months. I've dreamed of conducting this orchestra since I was a student at Juilliard. I'm not going to let anyone's prejudice rob me of that opportunity. As the group began to move toward the stage, Marcus Thompson continued his live stream, providing commentary for the thousands of viewers who were now invested in the story. The hashtag #JusticeForAntoine had been joined by Let Him Conduct, with people around the world expressing their support for Antoine and their outrage at his treatment. The orchestra members were already in their positions when Antoine finally made his entrance. They rose as one, offering a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. The audience, many of whom had heard about the backstage incident through social media, joined in the applause. The sound was thunderous, a show of solidarity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the concert hall. Antoine stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. He could see people of all ages and backgrounds, united in their love of music and their support for justice. In the front row sat Robert Whitman, his face still flushed with embarrassment, but his eyes shining with pride. Scattered throughout the audience were other musicians, critics, and music lovers who had come to witness what they knew would be a historic performance. He raised his baton, and the concert hall fell silent. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the weight of history balanced on the edge of a musical note. Then, Antoine brought the baton down, and Brahms' Symphony No. 4 began to unfold in all its complex beauty. The performance was transcendent. Antoine conducted with a passion and intensity that seemed to pour directly from his soul into the music. Every gesture was precise, every cue perfectly timed, every dynamic carefully crafted. The orchestra responded as if they were extensions of his own body, creating a sound that was both technically perfect and emotionally overwhelming. During the second movement, Antoine's thoughts drifted to his grandmother, who had died 3 years earlier, but who had always believed he would achieve great things. He thought of Mrs. Henderson, his middle school music teacher, who had first put a baton in his hands. He thought of all the conductors who had come before him, breaking barriers and opening doors, making it possible for him to stand on this stage. The third movement was a dance of light and shadow, the orchestra weaving together themes that seemed to speak directly to the human condition. Antoine felt the music flowing through him, felt the connection between himself and every musician on stage, between the stage and every person in the audience. This was why he had become a conductor, not for the prestige or the recognition, but for these moments when music became a bridge between souls. As the final movement built to its climactic conclusion, Antoine could feel the energy in the concert hall reaching a crescendo. The audience was completely absorbed in the music, carried along by the power and beauty of the performance. When the last note faded into silence, the applause was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. People were crying, cheering, holding up their phones to capture the moment. Several audience members were live streaming the applause, adding to the millions of people around the world who were following the story. Antoine took bow after bow, his face shining with sweat and triumph. But the evening wasn't over. As the applause finally began to die down, Robert Whitman took the stage. His voice, amplified by the concert hall's sound system, carried to every corner of the venue. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude tonight's extraordinary concert, I want to address what happened backstage this evening. Our guest conductor, Antoine Williams, was wrongfully detained and threatened by a member of our security staff. This incident was the result of racial profiling and prejudice, pure and simple. It has no place in our concert hall or in our society. The audience listened in stunned silence as Whitman continued. The Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall has always prided itself on being a place where the highest forms of artistic expression can flourish. Tonight, we failed to live up to that standard. We failed Antoine Williams, and we failed all of you. I want to publicly apologize to Antoine and to announce that we are taking immediate steps to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. Whitman turned to Antoine, who was still standing at the podium. Antoine, would you like to say something to the audience? Antoine took the microphone, his hand still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the performance. He looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected the full diversity of the city: black, white, Latino, Asian, young, old, rich, poor, all united in their love of music. Thank you, Antoine said simply. Thank you for your support, for your applause, for your willingness to listen. Music has always been my refuge, my sanctuary, my way of speaking to the world. Tonight, you allowed me to share that with you, despite the obstacles we faced. This is why I became a conductor, not to make history, but to make music. But if making music can also make history, if it can help break down barriers and open minds, then I'm honored to play that role. He paused, gathering his thoughts. What happened tonight was painful, but it was also illuminating. It showed us that we still have work to do, that we can't take progress for granted. But it also showed us the power of solidarity, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the ability of music to triumph over hatred and prejudice. The applause that followed was different from the earlier ovations, quieter, more thoughtful, but no less heartfelt. People were processing what they had witnessed, understanding that they had been part of something larger than a concert. As the audience began to file out, many stopped to speak with Antoine, to thank him, to express their support. A young black girl, no more than 10 years old, approached the stage with her parents. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she looked up at the conductor. "Mr. Williams," she said in a small voice, "I play the violin. My teacher says I'm really good. Do you think I could conduct an orchestra someday?" Antoine knelt down to her level, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. "What's your name?" "Amelia." "Well, Amelia, if you love music and you're willing to work hard, you can do anything. You can conduct orchestras. You can compose symphonies. You can change the world with your music. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Amelia walked away with her parents, beaming with pride and possibility, Antoine felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The evening had been traumatic in many ways, but it had also been transformative. Karen Morrison's prejudice had inadvertently created a platform for a much larger conversation about race, equality, and opportunity in the arts. In the days that followed, the story of Antoine Williams and the Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall became a national sensation. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and it became a topic of discussion on talk shows, in classrooms, and around dinner tables. The video of Karen Morrison holding Antoine at gunpoint was viewed millions of times, becoming a stark illustration of the prejudice that still existed in society. Karen Morrison herself became a cautionary tale. She was not only fired from her position at the concert hall, but also faced criminal charges for assault with a deadly weapon. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive, with the evidence captured on multiple phones and security cameras leaving no room for ambiguity. She was sentenced to community service and mandatory diversity training, though many felt the punishment was too lenient given the severity of her crime. But the real story wasn't about Karen Morrison's downfall. It was about Antoine Williams' triumph. The concert was recorded and released as a live album, with proceeds going to music education programs in underserved communities. It debuted at #1 on the classical music charts and became one of the best-selling classical recordings of the year. More importantly, the incident sparked a nationwide conversation about diversity in classical music. Orchestra boards across the country began examining their hiring practices, their programming choices, and their commitment to inclusion. The Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall announced a new fellowship program for young conductors of color, with Antoine serving as the program's artistic director. 6 months later, Antoine returned to the Grand Metropolitan for a follow-up concert. This time, there were no incidents, no confrontations, no questions about his right to be there. The concert was another triumph, with critics praising both his technical mastery and his ability to connect with audiences on an emotional level. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came after the concert, when Antoine was approached by a young black man in his 20s. The man introduced himself as Derek, a music student at a local university who had been inspired by Antoine's story to pursue conducting. "Mr. Williams," Derek said, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the beautiful music, but for showing me that it's possible. I've been afraid to pursue conducting because I didn't think I'd be accepted. But after seeing what you went through and how you handled it, I know I can do it too." Antoine smiled, remembering his own young self, full of dreams and uncertainties. "Derek, the path won't always be easy. You'll face obstacles, some of them unfair. But if you have the talent and the determination, you can overcome them. And every barrier you break down makes it easier for the next person." As Antoine walked through the streets of the city that night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The confrontation with Karen Morrison had been painful, humiliating, and traumatic. But it had also been a catalyst for change, a moment when the hidden prejudices of the classical music world were exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. The little girl, Amelia, had written him a letter a few weeks after the concert. In her careful handwriting, she had told him about her violin lessons, her dreams of conducting, and her determination to practice every day. She had included a drawing of herself on a podium, conducting an orchestra, with Maestro Amelia written in crayon at the bottom. That drawing now hung in Antoine's home office, next to his diplomas and awards. It reminded him daily of why his work mattered, of the doors that needed to be opened, of the young people who were counting on him to succeed. The Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall had undergone significant changes in the wake of the incident. The board of directors had implemented new diversity and inclusion policies, had hired a more diverse staff, and had committed to programming that reflected the full spectrum of musical traditions. The concert hall that had once been a bastion of exclusivity was becoming a more welcoming space for artists and audiences of all backgrounds. Antoine's career had reached new heights. He was now in demand as a guest conductor with orchestras around the world, and he had been offered several permanent positions as music director. But he had chosen to remain freelance, using his platform to advocate for diversity and inclusion in classical music. One evening, almost a year after the incident, Antoine was preparing for another concert when he received an unexpected visitor. Officer Robert Hayes, the policeman who had responded to the scene that night, knocked on his dressing room door. "Mr. Williams, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you before your concert tonight." Antoine invited him in, curious about what the officer wanted to discuss. "I've been thinking about that night for months," Officer Hayes said. "About how close we came to a real tragedy. How one person's prejudice could have destroyed so much. I wanted you to know that the incident changed me. I've been working with community groups, trying to understand the issues better, trying to be part of the solution." Antoine was moved by the officer's honesty and commitment to growth. Officer Hayes, change often comes from the most unexpected places. What happened that night was terrible, but it also opened eyes and hearts. That includes yours. As Officer Hayes left, Antoine thought about the ripple effects of that difficult evening. Karen Morrison's prejudice had been exposed and condemned, but it had also sparked conversations, created opportunities, and inspired people to examine their own biases. Sometimes the most important changes came from the most painful experiences. The concert that night was another success, with Antoine leading the orchestra through a program that included works by composers from diverse backgrounds. In the audience, he spotted several familiar faces: Robert Whitman, who had become a genuine ally and friend; Marcus Thompson, whose live stream had helped bring justice to the situation; and, in the third row, Amelia, now a year older and still dreaming of her own conducting career. After the final bow, as the applause washed over him, Antoine felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the music, not just for the success, but for the journey that had brought him to this moment. The confrontation with Karen Morrison had been one of the most challenging experiences of his life, but it had also been transformative. He had learned that prejudice still existed in places where it shouldn't, that the fight for equality was far from over. But he had also learned about the power of solidarity, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the ability of music to heal and unite. As he packed up his baton and prepared to leave the concert hall, Antoine thought about the young musicians who would follow in his footsteps, the barriers that had been broken, and the doors that had been opened. The work was far from finished. But tonight, in this moment, he felt hopeful about the future. The Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a beacon of possibility. And Antoine Williams, the conductor who had faced down prejudice with dignity and grace, had become not just a musician, but a symbol of change. Music, as he had always believed, had the power to transform hearts and minds. And on that night, almost a year ago, when a security guard had pointed a gun at him and questioned his right to be there, that power had been on full display, not just in the notes and rhythms of Brahms's Symphony No. 4, but in the courage of those who had stood up for justice, in the voices of those who had demanded change, and in the dreams of a little girl named Amelia, who now knew that anything was possible. The concert that was meant to be a celebration of music had become something much more: a turning point in the long struggle for equality. A moment when the classical music world was forced to confront its own limitations and biases. And through it all, Antoine Williams had conducted not just an orchestra, but a movement, leading with his baton raised high, showing the world that music, like justice, belongs to everyone. Years later, when music historians would write about the evolution of classical music in the 21st century, they would mark that evening at the Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall as a watershed moment, not because of the confrontation, but because of the music that triumphed over hatred, because of the community that rallied around justice, and because of the conductor who showed the world that the most powerful response to prejudice is not anger, but excellence. Antoine Williams had taken his place among the great conductors of his generation. But more importantly, he had opened doors for the conductors who would come after him. And, in concert halls around the world, young musicians of all backgrounds now looked to the podium and saw not limitations, but limitless possibilities. The baton had been passed. The music would continue, and the symphony of change would play on.